Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 30th of November of 2024. Today we have a lots of very interesting updates, so let's start. And probably most interesting, most dangerous, and at the same time the funniest update are coming from Brussels. Today, as you know, yesterday and today there was a number of meetings between the United States Secretary of State Antony Blinken with different European authorities from European Union and NATO countries. And they were talking just about one thing: how to continue supporting and supplying Ukraine in the 2025 when Trump answered the President Office of the United States of America. And as a result of all these negotiations, we have the first results. For example, NATO plans to provide Ukraine with enough military aid to enable it to fight next year. That is after Trump takes office. Secretary of State Blinken said this after a meeting in Brussels with NATO Secretary General Rutte. Today the focus was primarily on what we could do to make sure that Ukraine is in the strongest possible position in 2025. Later we got additional statement from another NATO representative. For example, NATO Military Committee Chairman Admiral Rob Bureau said that NATO would have sent its troops to Ukraine long ago and kicked Russia out of there. But the problem is that Russia has the nuclear weapon. I'm absolutely sure that if the Russians did not have nuclear weapons, we would have been in Ukraine a long time ago and kicked them out. We would have done it, but they have nuclear weapons. That was stated, and you know that this is the real statement. This is not a joke. This is not something like stand up from some comedy. That was the real statement of the NATO Military Committee Chairman Admiral Rob Bureau. Of course, the Russians could tell the same. For example, the Russians could say if the Russia had 1 billion population, the Russians would already take under control Ukraine probably in 2022. But all these ifs can't change the situation on the ground. And while the NATO countries are thinking how to change the situation on the ground, the Russians are doing this on the ground. And now let's talk about the situation in Ukraine. And first we're going to talk about the Zaporizhzhia direction, where the Russians continue their offensive operation. As you can see, we have changes on the ground to the west of the village by the name of Velika Novoselovka. This is the situation by the end of the 12th of November, and this is the situation by the end of the 30th of November. The Russians indeed managed to improve their positions on the line between the villages of Priutina and Novodarivka. At least we can make these conclusions based on the video that was published by the Ukrainians. And in this video you can see several FPV drone attacks on the edge Russian positions. There are lots of episodes. Some of them were geolocated, some of them weren't geolocated, but one of the episodes took place exactly in this area, exactly in this point. Based on this video, we have adjusted the map between Priutina, Livadne and Novodarivka. Furthermore, according to pro-Ukrainian mappers, the Russians during the previous 12 hours managed to improve their positions even further in the northern direction and to take additional tree line under control. The main goal and the main purpose of the Russians is to establish at least fire, if possible physical control over the road between Novodarivka and Novopol. And if the Russians are able to do this, then I believe we can start counting hours when the Ukrainians will retreat from the village of Novodarivka. Furthermore, as you can see, we have additional changes on the ground in the village by the name of Rovnopol. As for this direction, we haven't received anything. Well, I'm talking about video. We don't have any video that can confirm Russian control over the settlement, but we have two important icons. First of all, we have report from neutral, reliable mappers that reported Russian control over the settlement. And also we have the Ministry of Defense reporting. According to the Russians, as a result of clashes, the group of forces East managed to establish complete control over this settlement. Based on these reports and icons, we have adjusted the map. Once again, this is the situation by the end of the 12th of November. This is the situation by the end of the 30th of November. And as we discussed in the previous videos, the main and the most important task for the Russians is to take under control or establish complete fire control over the road 0510 that goes from the village of Gulaya Polya in the southwestern direction towards the settlement and the city is the stronghold by the name of Gulaya Polya. If the Russians are able to take this road under control, any control, FPV drone control, artillery control, fire control, so we are talking about the level of losses. If the Russians are able to increase the losses along this road up to more than 50-60%, then the village of Velika Novoselovka would be caught into operational encirclement. And I believe as soon as the Russians are able to reach this road and to take under control the settlements like Zelenoye Pole and Novoselovka, then the Russians will begin another offensive operation, and we are talking about attack on the lines between Shakhtarsk and Razdolne, which obviously is going to start very soon, probably within the next several days. And if the Russians are able to improve their positions on this line and to take under control the village of Razdolne, or at least the strongholds around this settlement, then this is going to be already a cauldron for the Ukrainians that are currently located in the village of Velika Novoselovka, and this is going to be just another disaster and the end game for these units. Now let's talk to the south Donetsk direction, and we have a lot of very interesting updates, and during the previous 24 hours we got the significant number of updates between the villages of Maximovka and the village of Sukhiye Yali, and the concentration of icons exactly from this area tell us first of all that most likely this is the primary target for the Russians for the near future. Currently the Russians are planning to attack in three directions. We will discuss all these three directions in details. The first direction is the village of Sukhiye Yali. For these purposes, the Russians will try to attack first with the sabotage and reconnaissance group. They will make reconnaissance of the minefields, and they will prepare the foothold before the tank attack and tank breakthrough. The main purpose for the Russians in this case is to establish complete control over the village by the name of Sukhiye Yali. If the Russians are able to do this, then the Ukrainians that are currently located in the entire Kurakhove direction will be caught into operational encirclement. So during the previous 21, why have we made these conclusions? We made them based on the several videos and the significant number of videos that we start receiving exactly from this territory. For example, in this video we can see several FAB attacks, and once again every single time we saw the same videos in the same direction. That's first of all meant that the Russians were about to begin the full-scale advance. That was the same videos, the same explosions and number of explosions we saw in Vodyana, in Ugledar, in Bogoyavlenka, and every single time after such a heavy explosions the Russians were attacking this or that settlement. And also we can see the significant number of FPV drone attacks all over the entire village. A lot of drones, a lot of vehicles, a lot of equipments were destroyed. So now the Russians have 100% focus in this area, and probably maybe the Russians already launched their offensive in this direction. We just haven't received anything, but maybe during the next 20 hours we're gonna receive first updates. This is the first attack. The second area of Russian activity is going to be the villages, the intersection of roads between let's say this one between the village of Sukhiye Yali and Yelizavetovka, between the city of Kurakhove and let's say Bogoyavlenka. So we're talking about this stronghold. As you can see, even from this perspective, this is a very powerful stronghold. This is a very big, dense network of the fortifications, very complex network of the fortifications. There is a river, there is an intersection road, several bridges, there is a complex fortifications in the south of this territory, there is another complex in the northern part of Uspianovka, there is a village itself, and there is another dense network of trenches. So very powerful stronghold of the armored forces of Ukraine, and basically this is the base. This is the base and the key region for the entire Kurakhove direction. If the Russians somehow are able to take under control this stronghold, or at least to cut this stronghold from the mainland, then this is going to be the beginning of the end of everything. Ukrainians understand the situation as well, and for example the southern stronghold between to the north of Bogoyavlenka, to the north of Trudova, is under complete protection of the 72nd Mechanized Brigade. And I'll remind you that the most of units of this brigade, battalions and platoons, were defeated and destroyed during the battle for Ugledar. So this brigade is not in a good shape, but anyway they're protecting the southern stronghold. As for the northern stronghold, this stronghold is under responsibilities of the 33rd Mechanized Brigade. And for example, we remember this brigade yesterday and the day before yesterday because they were trying to repel Russian attacks in the direction of Dalnya. So now we understand that in the very near future the Russians will begin the full-scale offensive operation in the direction of the southern stronghold on the positions of the 72nd Mechanized Brigade, with the purpose to get as close as possible to capture Trudova and just to ruin this chain of defense. And today we got a lot of videos of how the Russians were improving their positions on the flanks, trying to secure the left, the western, the eastern flank to prepare everything before the full-scale offensive. This video was published by the 37th Marine Brigade of the Armored Forces of Ukraine, of how they were trying to counterattack the Russians and not to allow them to dig in deeper. We don't know for sure the results of these counterattacks, but the Ukrainians were counterattacking the Russians exactly in this point, which means that this territory was already captured by the Russians before these counterattacks. As for the northern direction, the latest update we got yesterday, even in the morning, the Russians managed to establish control over 50 or even more % of the village of Dalnya. For the previous 30 hours, we haven't received anything to understand whether the Russians managed to improve their positions or not, but obviously the Russians made everything they could to improve their positions and to answer and to cut physically the road 0510. Currently, the most difficult and the heaviest clashes exactly is taking place here. The main objective for the Russians in this direction is to cut physically the road 0510, which will allow them to begin offensive in the northern stronghold towards the positions of the 33rd Mechanized Brigade. If the Russians are able to destroy this defense line, everything that is located in among these fields, we're talking about the Ukrainians in the villages of Ganovka, Veselovka, Romanovka, Elizaitovka, Linovka, and these fields would caught in cauldron. And according to information we have, the Ukrainians also understand and realize the difficult situation that is waiting for them. So that's why the Ukrainians have already launched the retreat process, and now they're trying to abandon their positions from fields. This is the first stage of retreat, with withdrawing positions, first to answer the settlements along the river, and then step by step to evacuate everything in the direction of this stronghold. So we can start counting probably hours before this entire direction with the village of Uspienovka falls in Russian hands, because the situation is difficult. The territory was already captured in pincers, and the Russians are trying to tightening this territory and tightening every single day. Now let's move to the city of Kurakhove. During the previous 24 hours, there were very heavy clashes in this direction. The Russians are trying to finish the clearing operation of the eastern part, but the Ukrainians were sending more and more reinforcements and reserves without counting losses, just with the purpose to stabilize the situation. And when the Russians realized that it's very difficult to move further in the western direction, the Russians decided to destroy the bridge between the central and the eastern part. And as a result of missile strike, the Russians managed to destroy the main logistic criteria, and the Ukrainians in the eastern part were completely cut from the mainland, and the Ukrainians lost any chances to hold their lines in their positions there. Later we got several more videos of how the Russian drone was flying above the destroyed bridge. This is the destroyed bridge, and the Ukrainians, as you can see, now the let's say the edge line of Ukraine positions was already on the central part. The Ukrainians were using tanks, and then the Russians were attacking Ukrainian tanks. So summarizing everything, the Ukrainians continue suffering the significant losses now in the central part, lots of FPV drones, as you can see, but now due to the fact that the bridge was destroyed, now the Russians now need to think how to outflank and to answer the central part, probably through the farms. From one side, the Russians managed to ease the battle for the eastern part, but in the future perspective, now the Russians lost possibilities to use the bridge to move further in the west. Now they need to outflank from the southeast with the purpose to enter the central part. So from one side, it gave them some bonus, some additional energy, but on the other side, in the future perspective, the destruction of bridge made the situation much worse for the Russians, for the Russian offensive, for the speed and the, let's say, the tempo of Russian offensive. As for the village of Vilenka, today we have the pro-Ukrainian mappers update, and later the Russian sources published the video of how they were raising the flag in the central part of the settlement. The video was published by the 114th Mechanized Motor Rifle Brigade of the Armored Forces of Russian Federation, and in the final part of the video we can see the Russian soldiers that were raising the flag, raising the sign of 114th Motor Rifle Brigade. Based on this video, we have adjusted the entire village under complete Russian favor. Now the sources are saying that the clashes are taking place for the settlements of Nova Ilinka and the village of Berestki. The Russians are moving further in the western direction, and the longer the Russians are, and the deeper and the longer the Russians are moving in the northern part of Kurakhove water reservoir, more difficult and complicated situation the Ukrainians in the southern part of Kurakhove can face, because, for example, from these positions the Russians will be able to establish complete fire control over the main roads in the central part. So that's why once once again, I believe that the battle for Kurakhove will be finished much faster than everybody thought or considered. Now let's talk about the dam and the Kurakhove dam that was destroyed. For example, now you can see in front of your eyes the consequences of dam destruction. The main supply roads of the armed forces of Ukraine are completely flooded and covered with water. Very difficult to move. As you can see, the Ukrainians are forced to slow down the speed of vehicles as low as possible, which is the perfect situation for the Russian FPV drones. As for this moment, there are no drones and no attacks from the Russian side, but if the situation continues, the Russians sooner or later will establish complete control over this part, and they will destroy everything that goes through this area. So now we understand that the water from the Kurakhove dam went in the western direction towards the village of Andreevka, which is very important. And from this perspective, now the Russians will think how to improve their tactics to move in the southern direction from the village of Sontsovka, because the positions of the armed forces of Ukraine in this part are completely cut from supply. Now let's talk about the Selidova. During the previous 24 hours, we have lots of icons, lots of changes on the ground provided by pro-Ukrainian mappers and neutral mappers. And it's to understand the situation here, it's better to change the map for several dates. This is, for example, the situation on the 11th of November. This is by the end of the 12th of November, and this is the situation by the end of the 13th of November. Now we understand, based on the how map was developing, we see that the Russians are moving, and the current task of the Russians is to take control over village of Pustinka from the south and along the railways from the northeast. So this is the primary target, and most likely the Russians are planning to finish the battle for the village of Grigrovka by attacking them from the southeast and by attacking the village of Petrikovka from the northwest. So these territories are about to be captured and secured by the Russians, and most likely this is going to happen in the very near future. After this progress, after this advance, the Russians will change their focus for the next layer. We are talking about these territories between the villages of Zovtne, Novoputsinka, Shevchenka, Novoukrainka, and Lysivka. So this is the primary, the final task of the Russians in this direction, and most likely this is exactly where the Russians are planning to move. Now let's talk about the city of Toretsk, and during the previous 24 hours we can see that the Russians intensify their attacks, and we see that several changes on the ground were recorded. For example, let's take a look at the dynamic. This is situation by the end of the 11th of November, this is by the end of the 12th, and this is by the end of the 30th of November. Several changes were recorded. The Russians intensify their activity, and now after a very long operational pause, the Russians resume their attacks. Most likely during the next several days we're going to continue receiving additional updates from this territory. Now let's move further. As for the Chasiv Yar, nothing special. Siversk, nothing special. South in Kupiansk direction, the Russians launched the final offensive with the purpose to break the Ukrainian defense in this village of Terny by attacking from the north, and the Russians are moving along the forest in the direction of Yampolovka. I believe that during the next week, the entire direction, by the end of the next week, by the end of the, let's say, 25th or 26th of November, or even earlier, somewhere by the 22nd of November, the entire direction most likely would be captured by the Russians, and the Ukrainians would be forced to fall back. As for the north in Kupiansk direction, we have several changes on the ground. According to pro-Ukrainian mappers, the Russians finished the cleanup operation in the forest to the west of Kolesnikovka. So the forest around the railway station of Kolesnikovka was completely captured by the Russians, which is very important, because forest in any way is the perfect position where the Russians can hide equipment, different electronic warfare equipment, tanks and vehicles, maybe sometimes artillery. So, and this forest is already under the Russian control. Of course, for the Ukraine, it's going to be much more difficult to conduct reconnaissance operation with the purpose to discover the concentration of Russian forces. Now let's move further and let's talk about the Kursk direction, where the Russians continue their offensive operation. During the previous 24 hours, we have several changes, and the most important are coming from the north-southeast. The Russians managed to secure the village of Pokrovsk. I'll remind you that just yesterday the Russians captured small strategical positions between two bridges, and by this attack the Russians managed to cut the main supply lines for the Ukrainians in Pokrovsk, and after that the Russians conducted several attacks in the direction of the village itself, and basically the Ukrainians didn't show any resistance and were forced to fall back. Today we have the significant number of episodes and videos of how the Ukrainians were FPV withdrawing the Russians in this area. And based on this video, we have adjusted the map in Russian favor completely. Now the Russian artillery focus is moving further in the western direction, which means that Ukrainians currently are sticked to the river of Seoul, and probably in the very near future, the Ukrainians will abandon these positions and to move to the village of Guyeva. As for the northern direction, we have a lot of changes on the ground, and the most important are coming from the village of Novaya Sorochina. Today, the Ukrainian sources published a video of how they were after withdrawing the Russians on the territory of the settlement. A lots of episodes. The video is fresh, and based on this video we have adjusted the map in Russian favor. So this is the situation by the end of the 12th of November, and this is the situation by the end of the 30th of November. The significant progress, and the Russians continue advancing. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds to condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.